Hello everyone and welcome to Art and Action, a series of online events looking at the relationship between literary authorship, literary celebrity and political activism. My name is Ruth Scobie and I'll be chairing today's panel, which is the very last in this series, which has been running all the way through this very weird lockdown summer. The series is convened by myself at the University of Oxford and by Sandra Mayer and Jenny Toyer at the University of Vienna. If you're interested, I'd encourage you to check out the links which will be appearing in the chat, which will take you to our website. And there you'll find videos of almost all the Art and Action events so far, ranging across periods to look at topics from Victorian radical poetry to contemporary Tamil fiction to contemporary literary celebrity and prize culture in Britain, as well as some written interviews and reflections on these subjects by some of the most kind of prestigious and interesting people involved in research and writing. Now, today's panel we've given the title Authorship and Authority, and it promises, I think, to draw together rather beautifully some of the themes that we've been returning to again and again, or even just touching on briefly in previous sessions. The public and private selves of the author, the relationship between aesthetics and politics, agency and ideological appropriation. Focusing this time on some major figures of late 19th and 20th century European culture. So what that's left for me to do at this point is to introduce our speakers. I'm going to introduce all three of our speakers today. We'll hear from all of them, and at the end of the papers, we'll welcome your questions. So if you're interested, if you'd like to ask a question, please do feel very free indeed to add a question to the Zoom Q&A function. You can just type that in anytime during the papers, after the papers, whenever a question strikes you. And after they're finished, we'll discuss as many as we can. So I'm delighted to welcome as our first speaker, Fotini Dimaruli, an academic who works on English and modern Greek literature, often in comparison. Her upcoming monograph with Oxford University Press has the title Authorizing the Other, C.P. Cavafy in the English and American Literary Scene. And that examines the work of influential Anglophone writers who were pivotal to the rising international fame of Cavafy in the 20th century, which is something that you're going to touch on today. Fotini is also currently Outreach Fellow and Career Development Fellow at Keble College here in Oxford. Our second speaker is Margaret Scarborough, a PhD candidate in Italian and Comparative Literature at Columbia University, New York. Margaret holds a BA in European and Middle Eastern languages from the University of Oxford in Italian and Arabic, and a master's also from Oxford in medieval studies. A really wide-ranging kind of academic career so far. Her dissertation, Unforeseen Selves, Living Hermeneutics, Italy 1960 to 1990, examines the styles of existence of queer and feminist authors and activists in the late Cold War to offer an alternative domestic genealogy for the contemporary intellectual tradition known as Italian thought. And finally, we're delighted to welcome Tore Rem. His most recent book is Ibsen, Scandinavia and the Making of a World Drama. Tore is also the general editor of the New Penguin Classics Ibsen edition and is a professor of English language literature at the University of Oslo. He's published works on Dickens, Ibsen, book history, life writing and world literature, as well as several biographies of Norwegian writers. And he's also currently director of UiU Nordic, a very large interdisciplinary research initiative on the Nordic region and cultures. So we're delighted to welcome these three speakers, and I'd like to just invite Fotini to begin. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction. So hello everybody. I hope my screen is shared now. Let me see, share. Okay, good. So my paper today is called Can Dead Poets Speak Back? And it concerns specifically C.P. Cavafy and Cold War propaganda. So really, the idea for this paper came from a broader question, which had to do with me, for me, with reception, and specifically the challenges for those of us who study, I think, reception is what happens to the voice of the original. If meaning is partly produced through interpretation and readings, and then does the artwork itself ever speak back, as it were? And if it does, how exactly is this accomplished? Such matters become even more complex or even contested when relationships of power are implicated in reception. For example, in cases where poetry is co-opted for nefarious causes, for propaganda, or on more subjective terms, to serve institutional politics we might disagree with. C.P. Cavafy's reception during the Cold War is just such a case. C.P. Cavafy was an Alexandrian poet writing in modern Greek, and he lived through the so-called golden era of Alexandrian cosmopolitanism, and today has entered the canon of world literature. So great authors of the 20th century Anglophone literary scenes wrote about and promoted him, bringing to the fore different aspects of his work as these applied to their own projects, ranging from E.M. Forster's liberal response to the fascist threat during the interwar period, to James Merrill's poetic explorations on matters of stylistics and sexuality in the late 20th century. So an array of political affiliations became entangled with Cavafy's growing fame, unraveling roughly from the Bloomsbury Group in England and all the way to the Auden generation in America, with a relatively consistent political coloring, which addressed at different times matters of marginality, non-heteronormative sexualities, the destructive nature of patriotism, and of Western fantasies about the Eastern other. In the 60s and the 70s, numerous think pieces about Cavafy were published in the New York Review of Books. There, Cavafy became emblematic of the broader discursive climate associated with the New Left, and with the anti-American Cold War critique articulated by thinkers such as Noam Chomsky and Hannah Arendt. In other words, Cavafy decisively entered the world literary scene through the mediation of intellectuals and writers, broadly of the left and often gay, who associated the poet with socially progressive and counter-normative ideology. And this history continues to determine the way Cavafy is read today, for example, through the lenses of post-colonial and queer studies. And yet there is a different chapter of Cavafy's fate that has remained altogether unexamined. And this is his appropriation by anti-communist propagandists in the US and by the Greek dictatorship itself as a way to accrue political legitimacy. It is often the case that when we think of culture and authoritarianism, the first thing that comes to mind is censorship. So censorship, abhorrent as it is, often constitutes an act of rejection of a work we consider today worthy by the wrong actors. And in this sense, it can further affirm a work's value, at least for us today. But endorsement poses a different set of challenges. For example, when the ideologues of the Greek dictatorship, a regime largely reviled for its crassness and lack of sophistication, found Cavafy's poetry, a body of work both respected and cherished today, to be resonant with their cause. So Cavafy served a constellation of political agendas at the same time. On the one hand, he served the New York Review of Books' anti-establishment directions. On the other, his poetry was rendered a vehicle for anti-communist propaganda in the New York Times. In Greece, he was endorsed by dissenting voices of the anti-dictatorial movement, but also by the Greek dictatorship itself for its right-wing agenda. I will briefly delve in this paper into these contrasting examples because they pertain to the larger research questions that frame this work. And these are the following. Is there a uniquely authoritarian method to practice textual appropriation? Is there something unique about the way authoritarian regimes turn to poetry, and what do they do with it? And is this different to the way resistance employs poetry, for example? Can poetics lend themselves to ideological embezzlement? In Cavafy's case, for example, are there features in Cavafy's poetry that may have facilitated his ideological tailoring? And thirdly, can poems ever speak back and resist potential misuse? So could Cavafy's poetry speak back from within its content and internal structure? I'm going to look at some examples in order to touch on those questions, and I'm going to return to them in the course of the paper. The Greek dictatorship today, in order to give some context, is considered one of the darkest chapters in modern Greek history. The colonel seized power in 1967, capitalizing upon decades of political instability, the largely manufactured idea of an impending communist threat, and a widespread sense that Greece was in a state of moral decline. The fourth anniversary of the coup in 1971 was marked by the publication of an authoritative statement of the regime's ideological program, the ideology of the revolution, ideals, not dogmas, and you can see here the cover of the tract. The publication came at a critical time for the dictatorship. While membership in NATO and American military aid had initially supported the regime as a bulwark against communism, Greece was expelled from the Council of Europe in 1969 following the junta's human rights abuses. The writer of the ideology of the revolution, ex-communist propagandist and deputy prime minister during the junta, Georgios Georgalas, announced for the first time the dictatorship's enduring legitimacy as an ideologically driven revolutionary movement destined to protect Greece from a communist uprising. In detailing the dangers of the communist threat, Georgalas, who had been born and brought up in Egypt, turned to the Alexandrian poet Cavafy, conflating the symbolism of two of his most popular poems, Walls and the Windows, to describe the communist tunnel vision and the shackles of communist ideology. I will present these two poems briefly before moving on to the excerpt from Georgalas himself. So these are the two. The first poem by Cavafy, called Walls, describes somebody who feels hopeless because they've been shut out from the outside world. And I think the crux of the poem really comes in the very last line, where it says, "But I never heard the builders, not a sound, imperceptibly they have closed me off from the outside world." So it's a poem that plays on themes of entrapment and individual isolation. Another poem by Cavafy, also very popular, The Windows, is again about an individual who's entrapped and is trying to find a way out and cannot find windows outside of his enclosure or her enclosure. And again, the crux comes in the final line of the poems, perhaps the light, and perhaps it is better that I don't find them, the windows. Perhaps the light will prove another tyranny. Who knows what new things it will expose. So both these poems put forward a sense of existential aporia, and they play on a spatial dichotomy of inside and outside to present a condition of perpetual entrapment. For the dictatorship ideologue Georgalas, the enclosed, isolated individual of Cavafy's poems is a communist who is restricted by his very own conviction. And I quote from the tract, the dogmatist harbors the illusion that whatever he perceives constitutes the only and absolute truth. Through constant subtraction, he arrives at his own absolute view of the world. This is his dogma. Its follower ignores all other aspects of life. He views the world exclusively from his own point of view. He doesn't open any other window amongst the walls that surround him, which he has built and which close him off from the outside world. And this is a quote from Cavafy, of course. And he doesn't open any because, as the poet says, perhaps the light will prove another tyranny, since it would awaken him from the hedonistic self-deception that he exclusively owns the truth. So now I'd like to turn your attention to the phrase, as the poet says. Not only does the use of the definite article rather than Cavafy's name, rely on Cavafy's widespread cultural resonance to make a point, but it also merges Cavafy's voice with that of Georgalas. So Cavafy says, and Georgalas explains. It is interesting that the final line is quoted, yet Cavafy's nuanced commentary on the possible perpetual betrayal is erased. Communism is presented as a self-delusional prison from which there is a definitive escape, namely the truth capitalized of the dictatorship. And generally Georgalas capitalized notions such as truth and light to speak of the dictatorship as the ultimate solution to all of Greece's problems. It may seem that such brazen domestication is unique to authoritarian propaganda and unsuited to a more democratic setting. And yet, an even more blatant selective adjustment of Cavafy's poetry took place in the Foreign Affairs column of the New York Times just a year before the coup, at the height of the Cold War. In 1966, Cyrus Sulzberger, the prominent American journalist known for his covert cooperation with the CIA during the Cold War, appealed to the perennial symbolic popularity of Cavafy's Barbarians to craft political content that overlapped with the junta's anti-communist discourse, albeit from beyond the borders of Greece. And the title of the article that Sulzberger wrote was called The Bourgeois Barbarians. So now, in the original poem, Waiting for the Barbarians, which many of you may know, Cavafy suggestively presents, in a question and answer format, a city's decline and inactivity in the face of imminent invasion by a threatening other. The poem concludes with an ironic twist. The barbarians never arrive. But rather than offering relief, the news paralyzes the community, for dreams of salvation had been projected upon the arrival of the enemy. And the poem ends with a line, "Now what's going to happen to us without barbarians? Those people were a kind of solution." Now, in his article, Sulzberger identifies the barbarians as the communists, whose role he initially treats as a blessing in disguise. And I quote, "The great Greek poet Cavafy once inquired, 'And now, what will become of us without barbarians?' They were a kind of solution. For post-war Greece, the communists for a long time served the role of the Asian barbarians, a unifying menace. During a bloody insurrection, the rest of the country joined against them with a display of unity rare for Greece. The uprising was squashed, the Communist Party was banned, and that kind of solution is gone. Greece is now lapsing into its customary discord." Here we see the common practice of communist othering at play, in keeping with the rhetoric of post-war nationalism in Greece, where communists were considered to be outside the nation. What is more, Sulzberger's piece ends with an admonition. I haven't included that in the quote. And he ends with the admonition that the communists have in fact infiltrated the city's gates in disguise and are moving amongst quote, respectable friends. On a poetic level, both the idea of barbarians as instigators of unity and as infiltrators are misrepresentations of Cavafy's content. Sulzberger here works not only through erasure, but through creation of new content that is loosely based on the poem to disseminate the intended message. For this purpose, Sulzberger in this piece divests the poem from its open-endedness to illustrate a condition of emergency. The barbarians have arrived and they're amongst us, and resists Cavafy's tentative treatment of the binary between citizen and barbarian. In Cavafy's poem, the barbarians turn out to be something better than villains, and the citizens something worse than victims. Written just 1 year before the coup in Greece, the New York Times op-ed carved out an ideological space in implicit support of any political act that would drag Greece out of its, quote, customary discord, which made it vulnerable to communist presence. Notably, the colonels, and especially the regime's initial leader, dictator Georgios Papadopoulos, would resort to the very same reasoning in presenting the coup as a revolutionary act. In this sense, Cavafy's poetry, in the writings of Yorgalas and Sulzberger, worked as a transnational, symbolic landscape of ideological cohesion. Yorgalas embedded Cavafy in Cold War anti-communist rhetoric, rather than just domestic politics, while Sulzberger drew the Greek case closer to American interests by utilizing the insider voice of a Greek poet for the dissemination of his anti-communist message. There is no doubt, of course, that both Yorgalas and Sulzberger were capitalizing upon Cavafy's pre-existing symbolic authority, while creating it anew through the poet's addition to the ideological territories. This redeployment of shared cultural symbols and narratives is, after all, commonplace in propaganda. Relying on the past means that there is no need to craft new stories, but merely to tell old ones in new ways. But is there also something particular to Cavafy's poetic features, beyond his well-established popularity and authority, that made these selections, partial interpretations, and content manipulation viable? Like walls in the windows, Cavafy's Waiting for the Barbarians sets up binaries between us and them, inside and outside, self and other, and these are amenable to the vilification of any presumed enemy. Structured upon a territorial metaphor bereft of geographical or historical specificity, the Waiting for the Barbarians perhaps serves Sulberger's divisive portrayal of the communists as an existential threat to Greek civilization, a portrayal that in turn enabled him to craft an exclusionary notion of Greek national identity that served the agenda of the Cold War. Cavafy's dichotomies and binaries appear to lend themselves, at least to some extent, to elective adjustment, which amounts here to presenting two sides of the ideological spectrum and then siding with one of them. Amidst this all, however, Cavafy was also employed as the voice of dissent against the dictatorship in Greece. His work occupied center stage in 18 texts, the prime joint act of intellectual resistance against the dictatorship, published in 1970 by prominent Greek intellectuals and writers. This collected volume is considered a milestone in anti-dictatorial discourse and has been monumentalized as the most subversive textual event in modern Greek history. It has also been translated in many different languages. In Dimitris Maronitis' essay, Arrogance and Intoxication, Cavafy's poem Darius is invested with undertones of resistance. In an inversion of Yorgalas's rhetoric about the dictatorship's capacity to liberate from the delusional enclosure of communism, Maronitis likens the dictatorship to a prison and turns to Cavafy in his quest for a symbolic language to speak of these conditions. In the context of Cavafy's dictatorial afterlife, Maronitis' essay reads as a response not only to the dictatorship's repressions, but also, perhaps unwittingly, to the place that Cavafy symbolically deserves outside the prison of the colonel's propaganda, or even as an intellectual weapon against it. It should be noted that opposite Maronitis stood not only the dictatorship's propaganda, but also pro-dictatorial scholars who read Cavafy in ways that dovetailed with the goals of the regime. And now to return to the initial question, how do we distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate appropriation? Even as it may be tempting, largely on emotional grounds, to speak of misappropriation and misreading or distortion when it comes to politics one finds distasteful, there are some issues with employing those terms a priori, without qualifying them on a textual basis. So if we are to engage with the textualities of reception, as well as their potential repercussions, it somehow seems necessary to assess whether appropriative methods are illegitimate in themselves, rather than consider them as such because of the legitimacy of the politics of the ends. So how do we evaluate the mechanics of poetic engagement vis-a-vis the politics? Now, Seamus Heaney, in the Redress of Poetry, wrote about the place of poetry in a world of political action and what it means for poetic writing to both resist and address it. And I quote from Seamus Heaney, "Poetic fictions, the dream of alternative worlds, enable governments and revolutionaries as well. It's just that governments and revolutionaries would compel society to take on the shape of their imagining, whereas poets are typically more concerned to conjure with their own and their reader's sense of what is possible or desirable or indeed imaginable." Sorry. Now, Heaney was sympathetic to poetry that would meet the needs of the field of force of political activism, but warned that a balance tipping could be affected when, quote, engaged parties expected poetry to be an exercise of leverage on behalf of their point of view, the entire weight of the thing to come down on their side of the scales, unquote. In such a case, poetry is valued less for its, quote, distinctly linguistic means and more for its immediate function, and is therefore at risk of losing its, quote, artistic integrity. Now, what is arresting about Cavafy's use on the resistance side in 18 texts is that there is an intersection between politics and scholarship. So other than conveying a didactic message, which it does, the text is also attentive to Cavafy's poet protagonist, the complexities of his situation, his confrontations with power, and also the emotional journey he undergoes. Maronitis is a philologist, and he unpicks the poem's layered nature with the incisiveness of an invested reader rather than the force of a politician. Rather than setting the poem directly to the service of a particular reality, he roughly maps out a contemporary situation upon Cavafy's artistic imagining of some equivalent labyrinth. I think that it is on grounds of this breathing space, which is created firstly on a formal level, the poem's analysis is separated from the more politically oriented part of the text. And secondly, on a reader participation level, the poem is presented in relevance to the reader's situation and not as an abstraction, and not merely on value judgments pertaining to the nature of the politics themselves, that Maronitis' essay does justice to the artistic integrity of Cavafy's poem in a way that other propagandistic texts do not. Maronitis himself explained the reasoning behind his selection of Cavafy's poem. He said, in this instance, we need poems that do not deliberately belong to so-called engaged poetry, so as not to come up against just or unjust prejudices. Moreover, we need poems whose identity is known and easily perceived by all. Finally, our very recent poetry cannot be deciphered without violent and hasty gestures, and it is useful to avoid these here. It is the same reasoning that must have to some extent underpinned all of the appropriations examined here. Cavafy became immersed in the tensions and conflicts of a political moment, for he was a famous dead poet of unknown political convictions. He therefore could not speak and did not belong, and was perhaps infinitely malleable, precisely because he could not speak and he did not belong. And yet there is still the poetry. Returning to the initial question, is it possible for the work itself to resist its many adaptations? I would say that since politics are open to contestation and potential readings are infinite, it falls on textual criticism to test not merely the legitimacy of a political claim, but also how much of the poetry in fact survives after the leverage, as Seamus Heaney calls it, that burdens reception has been exercised. Thank you very much. So this is the end of my paper. And I would now like to pass on to Margaret, who is going to present her paper called Socrates Goes to the Moon.
Hi, thank you, Fotini, and thank you, Sandra, and the other organizers of Art in Action for the opportunity to be here with you. My gratitude also to Torch for hosting the event. Today I'm going to present a little bit of my research. Some of it will be somewhat simplified. I hope that doesn't cause any problems. As I prepared for today, I couldn't help but think that Pasolini, the Italian intellectual poet and filmmaker, had he been in my shoes, would have had something to say about Zoom as a medium. And he would have also had something to say about the format of our discussion, an academic seminar in which we speak frontally to an audience we cannot see. He considered television worse than the atomic bomb. It bothered him that viewers were anonymous. He thought this established a relationship of inequality between speaker and viewer, of superior to inferior. These webinars can hardly be considered a media event. I don't think so, at least, I hope not. And Zoom isn't television, but it is interesting to think about how Zoom alters or reproduces existing discursive modalities and power relations. Here, I also note that Pasolini despised academic conferences for the same reason, for the hierarchy they created or implied between the bearers of knowledge and knowledge's recipients, for the fact that they confirmed his authority rather than undermine it. He was interested, above all, in horizontal relationships. I don't want to make any assumptions about how well you know Pasolini, who is very, very easily caricatured, but I will give you a bit of biographical background. He was a Marxist and an out homosexual in conservative Catholic Italy. He grew up under Mussolini, established himself as a prolific poet, novelist, and critic in the post-war, and received attention at home and abroad as a film director in the 1960s and 70s with scandalous films such as Terem and Salo. In the 60s, like many other leftists of his generation, he became an increasingly outspoken critic of consumerism and other societal changes he blamed on the global spread of capital. In 1975, he was brutally murdered at the age of 53. In some respects, the title of my paper is a misnomer. Pasolini was always democratic in the sense that he was always egalitarian. But I have become curious in the specific emphasis he places on democracy starting in the mid-1960s, when, unsurprisingly, he also begins to link his name to that of Socrates, the Greek philosopher we associate with truth, self-knowledge, dialogue, and questioning. Before becoming a film director, Pasolini had considered himself only a lyric poet, or primarily a lyric poet, a Rimbaud. A devotee of Antonio Gramsci, however, he also viewed himself as a committed organic intellectual. Gramsci's intellectual, you might recall, should actively participate in practical affairs and try to foster the new spirit of the working class. Pasolini embraced this role very heartily. In 1960, he started contributing regularly to the Italian Communist Party weekly. In his column called Dialogues with Pasolini, readers wrote in with questions about literature, Marxism, and current events. In his responses, Pasolini challenged readers to rethink his status as a figure of authority. In 1964, for example, he apologized for having been too official, saying he no longer wanted to have authority or take part in the myth of authority readers were looking for. He didn't want to rest on his laurels either. Authority couldn't be stockpiled, he wrote, but had to be constantly renewed in actual scenarios. He admitted also that he had a tendency to get on his high horse and asked readers, as a corrective, to treat him more democratically, that is, to help him cultivate what he called his democratic nature. Pasolini repeats this move over and over and over again in other articles and interviews. So in the 1960s, Pasolini had become convinced that Italy, which was coming to the end of what's called the economic miracle, so this period of post-war economic boom, had been unified via mass media and industrialization, consumer culture, and goods. As a result, Italians were becoming all alike, all middle class, and were all thinking the same middle class thoughts and speaking the same language for the first time. Before they had spoken many dialects, which they continued to speak, but Italian was standardized for the first time. And because Italian as a language contributed to this national standardization, he toyed with abandoning Italian as an act of resistance, making films, which he thought allowed direct, unmediated access to reality, was one way of doing this. He cut his ties with organized Marxism, which he considered to not understand the nature of the changes afoot in Italian society, and moved towards the radical left, and his larger battle against what he termed dehumanization, or the loss of singularity and reflective capacity of individuals. Although I should say he remains allegiant to the Communist Party as his preferred choice. He moves to the left, but he's still in favor of communism. Socrates comes into this picture in a big way in 1966 when Pasolini falls ill with an ulcer. In his sickbed, he rereads the dialogues of Plato and almost overnight adopts a Socratic persona, recasting himself as an intellectual willing to renounce his life for the sake of truth and the life of the polis. So I'm going to show you a clip, which I hope can give you an idea of this kind of Socratic persona that Pasolini adopts in this period. And it's from a 1966 film.
Sento immediatamente il dovere di non essere arrabbiato ma rivoluzionario. Ed essere rivoluzionario in questo momento in Italia significa assumere un'altra forma di moralismo. Sono anche i comunisti rivoluzionari italiani in questo momento, sono tutto sommato ancora di borghesi o di piccolo borghesi in doppio petto, che anziché avere alle loro spalle a rassicurarli i dogmi del cattolicesimo, del conformismo borghese, hanno i dogmi dell'ideologia marxista. Questo in generale naturalmente sono dei casi. Ecco perché il mio tipo di rabbia non catalogabile si presenta in realtà come uno dei casi di rabbia in Italia. Ora vorrei aggiungere che per me l'arrabbiato ideale, il meraviglioso arrabbiato della tradizione storica è Socrate. Non credo che non ci sia caso di rabbia più sublime di questo. Tuttavia la società ateniese era a suo modo sublime. c'erano comunque in questo sistema eletto che accusavano ingiustamente Socrate in nome del conformismo del tempo. Socrate ha risposto a tutto questo in quel modo che si sa, senza tuttavia essere un rivoluzionario, ma rendendo semplicemente quello che oggi è uno striscione che andava in giro da una palestra all'altra di Atene, alla periferia di Atene.
So another interview, Pasolini explains the distinction he's made here between being angry, arrabbiato, and being revolutionary. The angry or enraged person can system within the system with the goal of modifying it so that it can survive, while the revolutionary tries to overthrow the existing system only to end by reproducing it. That's what he calls this moralism of certain revolutionary sectors of Italian society. For Pasolini, Socrates is exemplary because he acts to save the institution of democracy itself. The enraged person, I quote, does not come to his senses, get bored, or learn his lesson, but is like litmus paper. That's Pasolini. She is someone who reacts while respecting the law. Pasolini also identifies with Socrates for other reasons. In a rant against television, for example, he writes that poor old barefoot Socrates with his dirty tunic would have called TV an exercise in misology or the hatred of reason. He upholds Socrates as a model libertine and homosexual too, making the case that his love of young boys, or pederasty, was the very basis of Socrates' vocation as a teacher. An autobiographical poem clarifies how Pasolini's definition of political commitment changes via this identification. Socrates is a historical figure who lives his ideas in constant dialogue with others and in the visibility of the form. A commitment modeled on Socrates becomes something that cannot be achieved through writing alone, but has to be lived as total action. And I quote, "Though a poet, I want only to live, because life expresses itself only with itself. I would like to express myself with examples, throw my body into the struggle. But if the actions of life are expressive, expression is also action." So we can see that Pasolini's understanding of as total action in turn transforms his conception of poetry. I quote, "The actions of life will be only communicated, and these will be poetry, since, I repeat, there is no other poetry than real action," end quote. This commitment, really the conflation of action and poetry, which Pasolini describes as two modes of action or two sides of the same coin, takes several forms. Pasolini dedicates himself to making difficult films that will force viewers to think critically rather than entertain them. That's one way of acting, or one way he chooses to act. He experiments with theater, which he envisions as a venue for reproducing the public form of Athens, of creating an experience of democracy as a collective and small-scale activity based in dialogue and debate. And he considered theater, the choice of theater is very specific, a form of struggle against mass culture, an anachronism in that it could not be mass-produced and did not pedal to mass interest. The plays he writes are aimed at fostering the exchange of opinions and ideas and creating a critical rapport between spectators and actors, with ideas as their protagonists and a mix of bourgeois, elite, and working class as their target audiences. His plays, I'm sorry to say, were a massive flop. In the same period, Pasolini becomes a very staunch advocate of independent cultural activities, such as local literary prizes, deeming them exercises in democracy. He similarly argues for the reform of the Venice Film Festival in 1968, arguing that the jury should be autonomous and made up only of artists, free of external political and financial interests. He increases his participation in roundtables and debates, as well as his journalistic activities, to bring his ideas to publics beyond the left wing. So he starts writing for really more centrist newspapers. In 1971, he collaborates with the leftist group Lotta Continua on a film project to polemicize the 1969 bombing of Piazza Fontana. The shadow of Socrates, I would like to think, haunts these activities. And we can see this, or we can see the constant identification with Socrates also through some of his planned projects. In a 1968 interview, Pasolini said he wanted his last film to be about the life of Socrates. The film would signal that he had achieved a pure and disinterested relationship with his public. The story of this last unmade film is complex. The life of Socrates, ostensibly morphed into an autobiographical and more allegorical screenplay, the Socratic protagonist was replaced by a figure more similar to that of Greek poet Constantine Cavafy, whom Fotini has just discussed in her wonderful paper. And Pasolini, it's important to stress here, had identified with and emulated Cavafy from the start of his career, especially when he was a very young man. And his decision to return to Cavafy, a poet, as his preferred persona or alter ego, rather than Socrates, the philosopher, coincides with his growing sense that he was still, at the end of the day, above all a lyric poet, and that poetry was still the most oppositional activity available to him, but it was still a form of action and of living as action, of expression as action, in that quote that I shared from the poem. So when Pasolini died, and even he was working on the screenplay before his death even, he intended to stop making films altogether and devote himself exclusively to writing. So this self-portrait as a Socratic Cavafy individual was really going to be the culmination of his cinematic career. So the moon of my title is also a little bit of a misnomer, but it refers obliquely to this last screenplay, to a motif of the space race that starts coming up throughout Pasolini's career, if you recall the moon landing in 1969. And in this last screenplay, the comic protagonist, accompanied by his sidekick, goes in search of a utopian vision and travels through the history and violence of the 20th century in search of a meaning that can redeem the world. He fails in his quest and returns to the cosmos, where he can, from a detached vantage point, survey the earth and his past experience, appreciating that life has given him a journey in pursuit of truth. Pasolini's early death prevented his desired return to poetry as action, but it was, seen in Socratic terms, a fitting death. That is, Pasolini felt that he was living in pursuit of truth. Should you be interested in learning more about the Socratic Cavafy Pasolini personage, Abel Ferrara's 2014 film, Pasolini, incorporates autobiographical materials, including scenes from the last screenplay, Porno Teo Colosso, to depict an angry, committed author who practiced what he preached, a portrait of the late and last, very political, democratic Pasolini. I leave the stage now to Tore and his paper on author Knut Hamsun. Thank you.
Hello there, and many thanks to the organizers for facilitating this conversation, and thanks for turning up. I have little more than a case study to share with you today, but it may throw some light on or open up a few issues related to the role of writers, the relationship between aesthetics and politics, and hopefully the ongoing discussion of this seminar series. It comes from Nordic, and more particularly Norwegian literary history, and it regards the career and the poetics, broadly understood, of the novelist Knut Hamsun. Let it suffice to say that Hamsun is often considered a pioneer of literary modernism, mostly due to Hunger, 1890, but also to other works of the fin de siècle, such as Mysteries and Pan. Hamsun soon acquired